Hi, I'm Nick Byrd, and I'm in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at Stevens Institute of Technology. And today I want to talk about how we can enhance critical thinking with generative AI as well as argument mapping. So I use decision science to understand and improve the ways that people think about things like logic and probability, but as well as ethics, politics, religion, and other things. And in my teaching, I require students to provide arguments for very specific theses, as well as objections and counter-objections. And since 2022, I've been requiring students to work together and individually visually map the logic of these arguments. So they already had to do teamwork and some individual work, but what I'm requiring now as of 2022 is argument mapping in these group and individual assignment settings. And so today I want to demonstrate part of the why and how of collaborative argument mapping, because a key reason has to do with these generative AI tools like you're seeing on the screen and that you've heard about and probably have tried using for various things. So in this screenshot, what you're seeing is a slide of Google Bard's response to my request to explain both sides of a debate about whether generative AI will undermine critical thinking. This is from June 2023, just to disclose that in case, Bard undergoes a substantial update that might impact your view of this. Now, I don't think this is very polished, but it is on the right track. In fact, it could even be a decent starting point for a student who's researching this topic for some type of assignment in their courses. And that raises some questions about whether we want students to be using tools like this to assist them on our assignments. So first of all, I'm going to need to get a basic understanding within the room of what argument mapping is. So argument mapping is a way to visualize the logic of arguments. So usually there's a single thesis at the top. Sometimes it's at the bottom, but there's a single thesis. And we will be mapping reasons for and against this thesis. So here's a classic example. It's a claim about Socrates. You usually see these in baby logic courses or textbooks. Socrates was mortal. Sometimes it's Socrates is mortal. And here are some reasons that we can map onto that thesis. So on the right, you can see a one premise argument. Socrates is already dead. And this premise does support the conclusion, but really only if we add a currently hidden premise about how death entails mortality. And on the left, you'd see a two premise argument. First, humans are mortal. Second, Socrates was a human. And when combined, and only when combined, we get a reason, a joint reason for the claim that Socrates was mortal, right? So here we have two different types of reasons, two different structures of an argument you could have for this thesis that Socrates was mortal. One of them seems to be assuming something that isn't explicit, which isn't great for if you're taking my classes, but maybe you're satisfied with the implied hidden premise. The point is just we're mapping reasons visually to a particular thesis, as opposed to just writing this out as standard prose, like in a paragraph form. So objections can also be mapped to a thesis or to underlying reasons. So a major benefit of visualization is that you can use things like colors and labels to convey lots of logical information at a glance. Things that wouldn't necessarily be so easy to convey when you're writing in standard paragraph or prose form. So this two premise objection has a red arrow and a bracket to distinguish its logical function from that of reasons, which are in green, right? So now we can clearly see what's a pro and what's a con, or what's in favor of and what's opposing this thesis. Just at a glance, we don't even have to like read the sentence to understand if the logic is to understand its relationship to the thesis. We can just at a glance, without even looking at the sentence, know that, which is something you don't get in standard prose form. So this objection is taking issue with the meaning of the word mortal. It's pointing out that on one definition of that word, Socrates did not seem to be mortal. Hence, it is objecting to the thesis that Socrates was mortal. Now, we can also map counter-objections to objections. And that allows us to rebut or even refute those objections. So this counter-objection, also in red, is indicating that the objection above is operating on a definition of the word mortal that really wasn't the intended meaning. When you look at the intended meaning of the word mortal, it seems that Socrates does satisfy that definition of mortal, and then it issues a warning about conflating two different senses of the word in order to come to a particular conclusion. When you conflate two different senses of a word, we call that equivocation. In logic, it's a standard fallacy. And so this is the counter-objection. It's also a two-premise format, although I'm not sure if I would agree with that structure, but that's how it's depicted here. Now, this map here was created using mindmup.com, which is just a free web browser app that you can use to generate maps of arguments. And you can change the labels, you can change the colors, you can do all sorts of other things. And then you can export these maps as a PDF or as a PNG, or importantly, as an SVG, which allows for kind of like infinite zooming in the case you have a huge map from an argument or something like that you want to zoom in on different parts of because it's too big to depict all at once. This SVG export is a helpful advantage of this platform over some of the alternative platforms. So, are chatbots any good at generating arguments or objections or counter-objections? They're not always great, but I'm finding that they're often passable. So I require students to optimize for clarity, cogency, and concision in that order, and to cite unassigned readings at their own risk. So you can already imagine, perhaps, how a chatbot might violate those criteria or the order of those criteria, because chatbots are trained on texts that are far less clear, much more wordy, and less logically rigorous than what I would expect from a student in my class. So chatbots' essays are often losing lots of points on my papers. This example from Google Bard is just straight up plagiarism. It uses ideas from multiple philosophers of mind without even citing any of them. And even if it had cited its sources, this response contains plenty of fluff. So for example, the final paragraph is just entirely vacuous. It adds nothing to the rhetorical or logical exercise here. It's just fluff in my view. And I am very against fluff, hence my third criteria of concision. The idea there is that I should not be able to rewrite any part or even the entire essay that a student has submitted using significantly fewer words. It should be very difficult for me to be able to rewrite what they've written using fewer words. And I could easily do that here by just chopping off the last paragraph. So here's a more concise essay with citations, and this one's provided by Microsoft's Bing Chat. However, even this essay deviates from my instructions by providing multiple objections rather than one. Also, it's not clear that the counter-objection actually overcomes the objection. So the counter-objection could be true without even undermining or even disputing the objection. So this essay would lose plenty of points, but it may still be passable depending on the kind of assignment a student is submitting it to. But look at what happens when I ask Bing Chat to create an argument of that essay. It simply encounters an error. So this time I use my smartphone to ask Bing Chat to, quote, create an argument map for the claim that the mind is purely physical, end quote. And I just skipped the step of asking it to generate a written argument, objection, and counter-objection. I jumped straight to asking it for the argument map. So Bing Chat told me that my colleague's Psychology Today post has an argument map about this claim that the mind is physical. Although Bing Chat is correct that my colleague's article contains an argument map, that argument map is about a very different claim. It's basically a complete failure to understand the topic either that I'm mentioning or the topic of that argument, or perhaps both, but just a colossal failure of understanding here. Now here's Bing Chat providing a decent argument, objection, and counter-objection, even according to my own criteria. So the 3 paragraphs follow the instructions, they cite their sources, and it mostly avoids unnecessary words. It's pretty concise. So it would satisfy my criteria fairly well. In fact, it's probably better than the average initial essay that I get from students in a 400 level class. which perhaps is not terribly surprising, given that the underlying language model here has also passed the bar exam better than most people do, and other sorts of like kind of graduate level tests. Now, let's see what happens when I ask Bing Chat to map that argument like students, or at least my students, are required to do. It's a terrible argument map. It's just monospaced text that uses some special characters to mimic the arrows that you would see in an actual argument map. See, a major advantage of argument maps is their use of things like colors and shapes that can quickly convey lots of logical information at a glance that raw text just can't. So we just don't get that from this black and white wall of text that Bing Chat is producing here. So although chatbots can write decent essays that consider multiple sides of a debate, they're not yet up to the task of visualizing the underlying logic as well as my students can. And this is one reason that argument mapping remains a valuable exercise, for now at least, above and beyond essay writing. So even if a student used this particular essay from Bing Chat, they couldn't yet pass the assignment until they distinguished every premise in that argument, including potentially hidden premises, and then correctly mapped each of those premises onto the thesis, such that it forms the correct map for this essay, because you can't just map this however you want. There are correct and incorrect and better and worse ways to map this argument objection and counter objection. They'd also have to reconstruct the map while avoiding any fallacies that Bing Chat might have committed or falsities that Bing may have introduced here. And so there's lots of skills that students would have to demonstrate in order to turn this into a passable assignment, even if they used Bing Chat to produce the entire essay, all of the text. They would still have lots of work to do to demonstrate the skills needed for the courses that I teach. So why else do I like argument maps? Well, in our research funded by the intelligence community, my colleagues and I have found evidence suggesting that we can depolarize people's views of arguments for controversial policies like restricting gun ownership in the United States. So what we did is we gave people an argument for restricting gun ownership here. And in one condition, people received just kind of a standard paragraph form of the argument, and people randomized to this other condition got a verbatim copy, but the text was a verbatim copy, but it was mapped out, right? So we had the map that you're seeing here in the bottom right. And whoops. All right, hopefully the screen just comes back. It looks like it did. Okay. So the evaluations of the pros arguments about gun control varied by people's prior attitudes about gun ownership. That is, people who think restricting gun ownership is bad think the whole argument for gun ownership is bad. And people who like restricting gun ownership think that the argument for that conclusion is good. So they're evaluating the whole argument based solely on what they think about the conclusion. However, when you give them the argument map, people's evaluation of the argument depolarize. People don't seem to be evaluating the argument according to what they think about just the conclusion. They seem to be evaluating it according to the quality of the argument. In this case, this is a relatively valid argument. And so what we're seeing here is that people who are predisposed to reject the argument because they don't like gun control thought it was a bad argument. But when we actually visualize the logic of the argument for them, we realize, well, okay, so this is a valid argument for a conclusion that I don't like, but I'm rating the argument, not the conclusion. And so hence they realize the argument is fine, even if they don't like the conclusion, and even if they might have independent reasons or feelings about the conclusion. And we can do the same thing for a policy that's kind of on the other side of the political spectrum. So here we have an argument in favor of a southern border wall in the United States, and we give people either the raw text or randomize them to a visual argument of the same exact text. And once again, we see that the map seems to depolarize people's views of the argument. And again, it's the people who wanted to reject the conclusion who seem to be changing the most in the map condition. And so this seems to suggest that this sort of like negative polarization that we observe in many contexts, both on and offline, and in various other mediums, whether it's cable television or some other place, this kind of negative polarization seems to mostly go away, if not entirely go away, as a result of making it easier for people to appreciate the logic of a particular argument. When it's hard to reconstruct the argument, like it is when you would just give people a wall of text, polarization is a nice heuristic, right? We can just look at the conclusion and say, like, I don't like the conclusion, so I'm probably not going to like the rest of this. Whereas if we give them the whole map that shows that just at a glance what the logic of the argument is, it's not as easy to just dismiss the entirety of the argument. Now, argument mapping is not new. It's been used and even studied for at least a few decades, a couple decades at least. And one of the earliest papers testing argument mapping against other teaching methods found that argument mapping curricula were much more likely to improve critical thinking performance in terms of a standardized critical thinking test. Argument maps have also been found to improve persuasive essay writing and even LSAT question performance compared to students who are taking a similar course that did not teach them how to map arguments. Since I've been requiring argument maps in all of my courses and assignments, this is the kind of feedback I've been getting, and students are basically often telling me, here, but also, I guess to my face sometimes, that they end up using argument mapping in their other classes. Sometimes they even use it at work when they're trying to develop a sales pitch or some other type of presentation for work, because they find that it not only organizes their thoughts, but makes their thoughts more persuasive to their audience when they're visualized rather than just like bullet points on a slide or just, a verbal speech, right? Having the map of the logic really helps people sell or persuade or at least understand the various moves in a debate in ways that, just writing a paper or writing presentation notes or something doesn't seem to do for them. Now, most of the argument mapping my students do is collaborative. So that is they're constructing argument maps in small groups, and they're occasionally doing it as a whole class. Like when I'm introducing argument mapping, we often do an argument map together as an entire class, sort of like I did at the beginning of this talk. So what I do is I give them a claim, usually from an assigned reading, and they have to fill in reasons and objections for the particular claim that I've put up. Pros and cons is kind of the most simple way you can think about it. And it's the way that the most simple argument mapping platforms do Word is just pros and cons. And there are already websites, as I'm alluding to here, that allow people to do this in groups. So here's a website where I found an argument map where people had started mapping out reasons for and against gun control legislation in the US. And I'm showing you a particular reason further down in the map about how restricting gun ownership would help protect police officers. So this is like a reason for gun ownership, which is a policy that many conservatives in the United States would not like. But the reason is a reason that conservatives will like, right? They tend to like rhetoric that is pro-police. And so this is a reason that they will tend to like that would lead them to a conclusion that they would tend to otherwise not like. So this is a particularly valuable way to use not just, arguments in general, but argument maps. So we can show people, hey, look, here's a reason that you probably like that supports a conclusion that you do not yet like. And that might help people change their minds. That's sort of what I think could be happening in the kinds of arguments I showed you earlier when I showed you how argument maps depolarized people's views of arguments about controversial policies like gun control. So if you wanted to use that QR code on the slide, you could see the rest of the map. You could add to it, you could edit it, you could update it, and join the argument mapping community. There are other collaborative argument mapping sites as well. This is because there's some research on it here that I'm alluding to in the very bottom. This is figure 1 from that paper. There are many, many other argument mapping websites. Some of them are kind of individualist, and some of them are collaborative like this, but there are just so many. I learn about multiple argument mapping websites every year and have been for years. So there's really no end to the amount of argument mapping platforms you'll find. And if I can just be honest for a moment, I have yet to find that any of the paid versions are significantly better than the free versions. Okay, so why do I make students do some of their argument mapping collaboratively? So in more research also funded by the U.S. intelligence community, my colleagues and I are finding evidence that chatting about problems with someone that disagrees with them tends to produce better overall reasoning than trying to figure out the problem on your own. So it helps people overcome a particularly faulty response on standard tests of reasoning. And ours and other findings like this are kind of convincing me that the critical thinking benefits of argument mapping could be enhanced if we do it with other people, especially perhaps if we do it with people who might have a different viewpoint than us, right? So if you and I disagree about a particular topic, I will not be as likely to think of objections to my own views on my own as I will be when you, the person who probably has thought of objections to my views, is there with me, helping me fill in the map of the various reasons for and against the view in question. And so this is part of the reason why I think collaborative argument mapping could have benefits above and beyond argument mapping alone. So before we get into the chatbots, the chatbot exercise involving some argument mapping, I want to mention a potentially major difference between the free chatbots on offer. So to illustrate the point, I need you to consider a question from the famous cognitive reflection test. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? So this is a famous question from a reflection test that's designed to lure people towards a demonstrably faulty response. That is 10 cents is the answer that comes to many people's mind. But if you think about this more carefully, you can see that 10 cents can't actually be correct, and it would have to be less than that, and 5 cents seems to work. Okay, so why am I bringing up this reflection test? Well, it turns out that GPT fell for the lure on these tests just like many, many humans did. In fact, it actually got more and more human-like, becoming even more and more likely to fall for that particular lure as GPT was trained on more and more human text. Initially, it was just producing like responses that really didn't make sense in response to this question. And then as it learned from more and more human data, what it did is it learned the lured response to the test. It learned the particular incorrect answer that most humans give to tests like this. And then between ChatGPT-3 and as well as 3.5, just GPT-3 and GPT 3.5, and the next iteration, such as ChatGPT and GPT-4, it immediately seemed to kind of correct for all those errors. And now it almost perfectly performs on this kind of test, which indicates that you might be able to test, your assessments or assignments on these chatbots and find that they don't perform that well, and therefore feel rather confident that your assessments are fine and kind of chatbot proof. But it could just be that next month they issue an update and all of a sudden these various bots and other forms of generative AI can produce exactly what it is you're asking your students to do, and therefore it's no longer chatbot proof. And so the point I want to make here is just that even if some of your assignments or assessments seem to be intractable to existing generative AI, it would probably be a full-time job to ensure that they reliably remain chatbot proof. And unless you're willing to put in the time to, kind of keep up with this arms race, I think a better or more realistic approach would be to kind of embrace the use of this generative AI in the classroom or for assignments or for assessments. They are already being used by employers in settings where employees are being evaluated. And so even in other evaluative contexts where people are actually getting paid for the work they're doing, these generative AI tools are being used. And so that would be perhaps another reason to be preparing students for that context. Anyway, this is just to say, I think some colleagues have, played around with these chatbots only long enough to see that a chatbot didn't ace their assessment and then feel kind of smugly satisfied with their assessments and then feel like I don't need to make any changes to my syllabus or assignment because this one chatbot that I tried, or this chatbot that I tried last semester or last month didn't do very well in my assignment. We have seen that, basically every month or every few months, these chatbots make drastic improvements in their performance to the point where they went from failing simple tests like this to passing and even exceeding most people's performance on things like the bar exam and the graduate record exam and other forms of standardized tests of high-level reasoning. All right, so now to the exercise. So what I want to do is give you all a chance to see how collaboration with one another, and even with chatbots, if you want, could help you map an argument, or I guess arguments, plural, objections and counter objections. So what I did is I created a blank argument map for the claim that for a very specific claim, sort of like I do with my students. And the claim is we should enable students to use generative AI in our classrooms. I find that it's going to be extremely easy to find arguments against this view because it seems like all of the forums of my colleagues in higher education is just full of people concerned about generative AI in their classrooms. And so they seem to have all sorts of reasons, or at least feelings, against this claim that we should enable students to use generative AI in our classes. So you can use the QR code on the screen, and then I'm also going to put the URL in the chat, and that will take you to the collaborative web page for the argument map that I've created. You will have to create an account if you want to participate in the mapping exercise. And what I'm doing here on the bottom, before we get there, before I transition to there, you can get started now if you want to go jump over there and you've already used these things. I just want to quickly touch on a couple of the most common chatbots that I hear about, at least. So I have Google Bard, Bing Chat, and OpenAI's ChatGPT, and I have the links to them on the page. And I just want to point out a few things. So one is that Bard and Bing use two different language models. I mean, they function in very similar ways in the abstract, but they are different models, and so they perform differently. Both the first two, Bard and Bing, are trained on data basically up to the present for the most part. One downside to Bard that I alluded to earlier in the talk is that it doesn't seem to cite its sources, at least not reliably. One downside to Bing is that you have to use a particular web browser that's, I don't think, the best browser by any means. And so I, don't find these first two options to be great, but the third option I find to be even worse. The third option is not even close to up to date. It's trained up to about 2021 is the last I checked, and it's not even the latest version of ChatGPT. Of GPT. It's actually still using the version of GPT that fell for the trick on that trick question that I showed you, 90% of the time or something. So it's just maybe not even a great reasoner. So there are pros and cons for all of these, cons for all of them, certainly. But, take your pick. And one thing you might want to do during this exercise is maybe use multiple of them to compare the differences between them, to understand how, small differences between chatbots can actually produce dramatically different and better and worse results for your purposes. So if you have followed that link in the chat or that QR code that I gave you on the last slide, as well as this slide, you might have clicked somewhere on the screen and then been asked to log in. I log in with my personal account because the site I've sent you to is the kind of public for everyone version of this website, but there is an education-based version of the website. It's kialo-edu.com. You can barely see it at the top of the screen here. The map that I've made is not on that website, but if you wanted to use this for your classes, that might be the one that you would want to use. I'm guessing it is going to be more HIPAA compliant or whatever the other types of compliance standards are for education. Because we are not in a instructor-student relationship, we can use the public version here. And so hopefully some of you have made it into the map. And if not, I am actually going to jump over to the map to begin showing you how it will work on my end. And, if you edit it while I'm working on it, then I might see some of your edits show up live on my screen here. So we have the thesis here. It's in blue on this little mini map above here on Kialo's format. So the thesis that we're talking about here is students should be allowed to use generative AI for assignments. And now what you can see is if I hover over these nodes below, I see green and red boxes, meaning positive reasons or pros according to Kialo's terminology, and cons or objections here in red. And then you'll see a bar above it, which indicates how much people have liked with the heart each one of these, right? So the more that people heart this, the more that this bar will fill up. And you can hover over the bar and you can actually see how that gets rated here. The veracity is, I guess, what it's supposed to mean. That's what people's ratings mean. And now you'll see here, I've got this claim here. We need to prepare students for employers that already require workers to use assistive AI like chatbots. This is a reason I mentioned in the chat. And when I click on it, it expands this reason and then shows that it's supposed to be a reason for this. And you can now see that this mini map is updated. It shows like where we are in the map. Now, if I go back to the thesis, it opens up. I clicked on the thesis and it kind of opens up all the reasons again. Here, I'm going to click on this one, this node here, this reason that seems to have a link embedded to it. And you probably can't see this on your screen, but there's something just below it with a little shadow above it, indicating that there might be more behind this. So when I click on it, sure enough, the minimap updates and shows me that this node that I've clicked on has an objection. And so here we see the thesis, this node that I just clicked on, and this objection that we can now see. And the minimap reflects that structure. And so we have a reason for this thesis, and then we have an objection to that reason for the thesis. And so this is all just to say that like there are ways to navigate through this map, and then there are ways to edit it. So suppose I want to issue a counter objection to this objection. I would click on this objection and then click on con and enter my objection here and then hit save. I can even add a link if I want, and then, update the text. So if I found like a reputable source that I was comfortable linking to, I might use that here. I'm not going to update this here because this map is public. You can find it on your own. But that is the basics of how we can visualize the map and then navigate through the map and edit the map and update the map. We should also have a chat feature. Yeah, so in the sidebar here, we can see there's ways to kind of chat with one another, whoever's on this platform, and we can use the @ symbol to maybe tag particular users in case we want to respond to a particular claim in the chat or something like that. We can share this, and there's other things on the map. There's this statistical circle that I just clicked, pulls up this kind of big overview page where it kind of poses the main question and that we're talking about. It shows this image that I have attached to the argument map, some background information where I raise a couple questions and then add a bunch of other questions to consider, some tags that I've put on here in case people wanted to search by topic. And then if we click each of these numbers, we begin to see various bits of statistical information that we can click on. And it's basically just telling me all of the edits that I've made to this because I seem to be the only person who's interacted with it because I created it like very recently, like hours ago. I can also click on these statistics. This is another way to visualize argument maps, right? So we have at the center the claim, and we have these red things indicating first level objections, meaning objections directly to the thesis. And then we have first level reasons, meaning reasons directly for the thesis. And then we see this outer level is beginning to form where we have an objection to a reason as opposed to an objection to the main thesis. And obviously this will expand with many, many levels as the argument map expands. And so this is just one way of showing how you can create an argument map that other people can contribute to and comment on and chat about, and various ways to visualize the map and understand the quantitative metrics of it and people's ratings of it. And this website is just dedicated to this. So you'll find tons and tons of topics and discussions. So if I scroll down here, you'll see there's a map and a big discussion group with over 1,000 contributions about should steroid use be allowed in sports? Should men be allowed to vote on abortion legislation? Even more activity on that one. Should general AI have fundamental rights? Lots and lots and lots of activity and views on that one. And so this could be a website that you would be interested in or your students would be interested in. And like I said, they do have an education version if you and your students want to use this site together in a way that will comply with some common education and privacy and other policies. But now back to the slides to bring this to a conclusion. I have depicted my conclusion in the form of an argument map. This map was created using mindwap.com. The thesis is that individual essays may require less critical thinking than collaborative writing or argument mapping. And I use that thesis because it seems like individual essays are still a common form of assessment in higher education. And I'm suggesting here that we might have better forms of assessment. And I'm sure all of you are already using those better forms of assessment, but I'll continue laying out the reasons for my thesis. So critical thinking essays consider multiple sides of a debate, arguments, objections, and counter-objections. And chatbots seem to be able to do that, as I alluded to in the talk. Bing Chat, I think, produced perhaps the best essay of all the essays I showed. And chatbots cannot yet produce good argument maps, but argument mapping does seem to be a valuable exercise for humans, at least. Both the construction of argument maps and the consumption of argument maps seems to be beneficial for humans. So it seems like there's an opportunity here. If chatbots can't yet do it and it's valuable for humans to do, then we might want to be requiring our students to do it, because they might not be able to just have a chatbot do the entire thing for them. But suppose we object, well, look, chatbots can produce other human-like images, so it's probably just a matter of time that they'll be able to produce argument maps as well. And my counter-objection to that, I think, reasonable concern is that collaborative argument mapping with humans or AIs may nonetheless expose people to arguments and evidence that they are prone to overlook or just not consider or to discount. So it might be that a chatbot can generate reasons against my view that it will be more persuasive than the kind of toy or straw person objections to my view that I will come up with as someone who holds the view that I have, right? I'm not going to be able to think of reasons against my view that are as good as a person who holds the other view. And so I do think that even if chatbots can produce argument maps that are just as good as the best students in my classes, it would still be valuable to me as a critical thinker to be able to see those maps and see the best construal of arguments against my view or of counter objections to my objections, so that I can see just how strong my views and my reasons and my objections are when put up against, a relatively intelligent or perhaps even superiorly intelligent agent like a chatbot. So there's my pitch. You could probably think of reasons and objections and counter objections that you would add to this. If you want to formalize it into an argument map and send it to me, that's the kind of thing I'd be thrilled to engage with and would think is very fun. So, it wouldn't be offensive or annoying for you to do that. Real quick, I did want to point you to the argument map about a public argument map about the topic that we discussed today, in case you want to go to that map yourself and update it, or comment on it, or add your own premises and objections and the rest, or maybe provide a citation for this claim that seems maybe dubious to me. So here's a link and here's a QR code if you want to go do that. But for now, I'll just say thanks, and I can take thoughts, questions, or objections.